And then he says, who then can separate us from the love of Christ? Can trouble do it, or hardship, or persecution, or hunger, or poverty, or danger, or death? No, in all these things we have complete victory through him who loved us. For I am certain that nothing can separate us from his love, neither death nor life, neither angels or other heavenly rulers or powers, neither the present nor the future, neither the world above nor the world below. There is nothing in all creation, hear this, there is nothing in all creation that will ever be able to separate us from the love of God, which is ours through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. If I can make a quick announcement, it is wonderful to know that we have someone who has a myriad of samples of creches from all over the world, literally. And they're here from enormous, wonderful places, and they represent a great love that Hedda has for those. So thank you for sharing them. After the service, if you'd like to come up and take a look at them, please do that. We're part of a men's Bible study, a number of us who are in the church, and it's an ecumenical Bible study of men. And oftentimes we confront words that we're not certain about, and we wonder about those words. And One of the words that oftentimes I think confuses children and adolescents and adults as well is the word that shows up in the Old Testament in particular, but more frequently we are confused by that word in the New Testament, particularly when we know that God has been identified by the act of the coming of Jesus into our lives as a God of compassion, a God of love, a God of kindness, a God who seeks us out and encourages not by demanding or insisting that we follow, but offering the opportunity to follow. So this is a kind and gentle and compassionate and loving God who wants us to do well, wants us to find ways to live our lives in such a imaginative and creative way that at the best that we can, we do that which will, in so many ways, say to our God, here we are. We've done the best we can. We've made every effort. We've made lots of mistakes. But here we are. And we offer ourselves to you because you've offered life to us, and we are grateful. The word that oftentimes confuses us is the word fear. Fear. And I want to maintain that the Jesus way is a fearless way, not a fearful way. That the Jesus way is a way in which we discover that we have been made free from fear rather than bound by our fear. Let me share with you some thoughts that are coming from a lot of research that behavioral scientists and psychologists have done. There are indeed at least a number of ways to understand fear. Fear is oftentimes that emotional charge that comes inside of us. It's both an emotional charge and an intellectual charge that we are in danger. That there's something happening or something out there that tells us we're at risk. And sometimes that something is also in us that is causing us to feel fearful. Now there are, I thought, just 2 ways to respond to fear. I'm discovering there are really 4 ways to respond to fear. One of them is the typical fight. Someone has suggested that the response to fear is anger. And so what we often think of is people who are filled with amount of fear will compensate for that fear by being angry and hostile toward others. It's a fearfulness of being embarrassed, a fearfulness of being shamed, a sense of fearfulness around someone damaging who we are as a person. And, Freud would talk about that as a weak ego, the person who just feels vulnerable all the time and is fearful of being attacked. And so we fight. And it's oftentimes the person who's the bully, who's the abuser, who uses that bullying and abuse to somehow compensate psychologically for the fear inside themselves, the need to control others when they themselves are totally out of control. The other response is to flee. It's called the fight or flee response, which is to find a way to run away from that danger, to get away from it as much as possible, to recognize that this danger is there, that it could harm us, that it could actually kill us, and so we do our best to run from it. We've discovered that if there's a bobcat on the trail, you don't try to run away from that bobcat because it can run faster than you. You find a way to do it differently in terms of that fear that you have. But to flee the fearful thing is not at all uncommon. One of the ways that we can flee is by discounting it, by disregarding it, as if indeed it doesn't exist. And that denial effort on the part of persons oftentimes lead to more dangerous and more potentially harmful occurrences to them. The third way that we deal with it is to freeze. That is to say, when we are caught in fear, we freeze up, we just lock up. In essence, we become paralyzed by our anxiety and our concern about that danger to us. And that perhaps is such a dangerous thing to do that indeed it may well be that there are so much better options to us than to just lock up and to stand there and to not do anything, or to not think, or to not consider options and alternatives if the fear is an internal fear. What are my options? What indeed might I do differently? And the fourth way is to comply. The domestic violence houses are often filled by people who are filled with all kinds of fear, and before they decided to flee, they oftentimes complied, or they became docile in their response to the abuse that they're experiencing, keeping in mind that oftentimes women in particular who are part of that find themselves with no other options. They don't have a good quality education. They don't have a family they can turn to. They don't have friends that they know because they've been isolated from friends that they can turn to. They don't think about how they might support themselves. So they stay in that abusive situation in hopes and in belief that it will change. And it doesn't change. Now, I think that fear needs to be better understood, both in terms of when we discover that word in the Bible, in the Old Testament in particular. The word fear has at least 2 or 3 meanings, but particularly 2 meanings in relationship to the context in which the term is used. And when you think about the people of Israel and the recorded history that they have given to us through the Old Testament, whenever they have disobeyed God's law, whenever they as a people have turned away from God, the prophets say to them, God will punish you. And their understanding has been that whenever they have been taken over and overwhelmed by the enemy, that indeed they have been in fact punished by God. And so when there is a term of fear used to describe the need for the people of Israel to fear God, because indeed God is capable of punishing you when you are a sinner, when you have broken your covenant with God. There's another way of understanding that word of fear when indeed we understand the context in which it is used, and that is to regard and respect and honor and worship God. So to fear God is to place God in reverence. This is God who creates. This is God who nurtures. This is God who shepherds. This is God who has strength. This is the God upon whose rock I rest myself. This is that solid rock of faith and solid rock that we find in God. And so the word fear in Hebrew can be better translated as regard and respect and honor and reverence and worship. I began to wonder, how often did Jesus use the term fear? Now, it's used 350 times in the Old Testament. I could only find one particular time in the New Testament, and it didn't show up in all 4 gospel accounts, only in Luke and Matthew. And the words are very simple, and I want to share them with you. They are words that come as a result of the concern that the people of Israel, or the people who are followers of Jesus, understood in their lives. And so that fear, which Jesus refers to, is a fear that is one that is to be understood as high level of regard and respect. If you look at Luke 12, for instance, and you look at the 4th through the 7th verses in Luke 12, it also shows up in Matthew. Luke, I suspect, was the first of the two to write. It may well be that the same message had gotten to Matthew, and so he included it in his account. These are the words. I tell you, my friends, do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot afterward do anything worse. I show you whom to fear. Fear God. After killing, has the authority to throw into hell. Yes, I tell you, be afraid of him. It's the only time I can find that Jesus uses the term fear, but what he is really saying, as the scholars who better understand the language than I sometimes do, is the reason to call attention to that is there is no power in the person who can kill. You're dead. But there is power in the God who not only gives life and birth, not only the power that can be found in a God who can in fact kill, has that capacity to do, is in fact the power to send one to hell or to send one to heaven. Now that's what is being said. Not that we are to be afraid of God, but we are to recognize God's enormous, stupendous power. What we have discovered, in addition to which, God is likewise has the capacity to have stupendous, unbelievable, outstanding, whatever words you want to use to add to that expression of enormity, to love. And that's who Jesus is. The Jesus way is that way. Jesus expressed gentleness and compassion to everyone. To the ones who thought themselves to be most faithful, he said, by all means, you have done all the things you need to do to get yourself into heaven. Now, one more thing that you might want to do. Sell all you have, give it to the poor, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. I didn't find anywhere in the gospel accounts that Jesus, other than the Pharisees and the leaders of the temple and the synagogue, who were leading, in Jesus' mind, people astray and forcing them to honor a style of behavior which sought perfection in a way that was impossible to do. 700, 800, 900 laws that people need to know and live by, and you could trip out on any one of them, and you know that Jesus was called on for doing one of the simplest things of plucking grain as he walked through it on the Sabbath. That was labor on the Sabbath. You weren't to do that. That was one of the laws. Or one would say, why not to heal on the Sabbath? To find compassion for the person who is suffering from paralysis or suffering from bleeding to death or suffering from anything else, but to heal that person whenever the opportunity arose, whatever the day may be. Because that was the call that Jesus understood as it came to him through his love of God himself. I think the Jesus way is to not fear, but to be filled with reverence and respect and honor of a God who has called us and invited us to be open to his message. A message of love, a message of compassion, a message of outreach to others with the good news, a message of self-giving, a message of being willing to die, that others might understand how much God truly loves each one of us. And you remember that little story, why are you afraid, or why are you anxious? Even God thinks about the flowers of the field. God thinks about the birds of the air. And how much more important are you? So stop being anxious and embrace joy, embrace wholeness, embrace wonder and discovery, embrace an awareness of forgiveness and the peace of knowing that you are part of God's people. God's Spirit is in you. Let it shine, let it be alive, let it be whole, and make you aware